She didn't know what was beneath the basement floor. Nobody did. The county assessors who condemned the property in 2003 hadn't looked past ground level. The teenagers who broke through the boarding on a first-floor window on a dare in 2017 hadn't made it past the foyer before the smell drove them back. The real estate investors who cruised past the iron gates twice a year, calculating demolition costs against raw land value, never once stepped inside. 31 years of abandonment discourages the merely curious. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Nadia Reyes wasn't curious. She was desperate. And desperate people go places that sensible people won't. She bought the Aldrich Estate on a Tuesday in March for $400.11. The 11 cents came from rounding up the county transfer fee. The $400 was the outstanding tax lien on a property that hadn't sent a single payment to Harker Falls County since 1994. The remainder of Nadia's savings, $433, went to the first month's electric utility deposit, a padlock for the front gate, and 3 separate trips to the dollar store for contractor garbage bags because she couldn't afford the economy box all at once. She spaced the trips 2 days apart, so the expense fell across 2 budget weeks. Old habit. Old math from a long time of not having room for error. She was 36 years old. She had 2 children. Marcus was 12, lean and careful in the way that children sometimes become careful when they have decided, at a young age, that certain questions no longer deserve asking out loud. He developed the habit around 9 or 10, around the time the first eviction threat had arrived in their apartment on Colfax Street, and Nadia had never settled the question of whether he'd learned it from watching her or arrived at it independently through his own reading of how things worked. Either explanation concerned her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, because it was a useful quality in the wrong circumstances, and their circumstances had been wrong for some time. Lily was 7. She still believed, with a sincerity that Nadia found alternately comforting and heartbreaking, that the universe ultimately rewarded effort and good intentions. She had believed this through 8 months in a shelter on Clement Street, through a school transfer mid-year, through more institutional dinners than anyone her age should have to count. Whether that was wisdom or innocence was a question Nadia had been sitting with for years without an answer. The shelter on Clement Street in the northeast corner of Harker Falls had been home for 8 months. It smelled like industrial cleaner and the particular closeness of many people in a space that was not large enough for all of them. Family units were separated by hanging sheets strung between bed frames. The bathroom on their floor had 1 shower that ran reliably hot and 2 that didn't. Nadia had identified which shower worked on her second night and had told nobody, not from cruelty, but from the accumulated understanding of a person who has learned, over many years, that small advantages matter when no large ones are available. She had come to the shelter in July, after an eviction notice gave her 10 days to leave an apartment she'd rented for 6 years on a block she knew well, near a school Marcus had been doing well in, and a park with a duck pond that Lily talked about with the specific tenderness of someone who has lost something and knows it. The eviction was not for non-payment. She had never missed a month. The building sold in February to a development company whose plan for the neighborhood did not include tenants paying $1,300 a month in a block they intended to reposition as something more profitable. The company offered a $6,000 relocation payment and 60 days to find somewhere else. Nadia's legal aid attorney, who was simultaneously managing 47 other cases, told her the offer was legal and the timeline was firm. Nadia took the money and went. The $6,000 lasted 3 months in a Route 9 motel at $220 a week. The room had a kitchenette with 1 working burner, a bathroom with a light that flickered intermittently but didn't go out, and a window that faced a parking lot and admitted enough light to cook by in the mornings. It also had 2 double beds, which meant Marcus and Lily each had their own, which was more than they'd had in some of the years before. She tried to hold on to that. By October, the money was gone. By November, they were on Clement Street. By December, they had a routine, which is what survival looks like when it goes on long enough to develop a shape. She had worked at the Harker Falls Marriott for 7 years, the last 3 as a shift supervisor at $17 an hour. She was good at it in the specific way that earns gradual institutional trust: reliable, thorough, The kind of person who solves problems before they become someone else's problems and doesn't need to be told twice about anything. The hotel let her go in May during a restructuring tied to a renovation project and a new hospitality concept that required what the regional manager called a leaner operational profile. He chose his words carefully when he delivered the news, which Nadia respected even while understanding that his words and her outcome were the same regardless of how carefully he chose them. She cleaned out her locker, took the bus home, and sat at the kitchen table doing arithmetic for 2 hours. Between May and July, she applied for 61 positions. 3 callbacks. No offers. 2 of the rejections were for jobs she was technically overqualified for, which is a specific category of defeat because it reads, on the surface, like a compliment. The third was a supervisor role at a commercial cleaning firm downtown, lost to a candidate with an associate's degree in hospitality management from the county community college. She understood how the outcome worked. She just wished she'd had the 2 years. She was sitting in the shelter's computer room in early March, waiting for a terminal to open so she could apply to a hotel management training program that cost $800 she didn't have, when the woman at the adjacent terminal pulled up a local news article with a headline visible from 3 feet away. Historic Harker Falls mansion heads to tax auction for minimum bid. Nadia almost kept her eyes down. She knew enough about tax auctions to know they generally produced one of 2 outcomes: properties with concealed liabilities that made them genuinely worthless, or genuine opportunities that reached fair market value in the first 30 seconds of bidding. She also had $843. That was not a number that belonged at a tax auction, but the photograph stopped her. It was taken from the end of a long, cracked driveway, past iron gates that had become something of a local landmark in the specific way that decaying structures become landmarks, which is to say through familiarity and the gradual transformation of embarrassment into scenery. The mansion at the end of the drive was 3 stories of dark red brick with turrets at the 4 corners and a portico wide enough to cover a bus. Ivy had consumed the east wing's lower 2 floors entirely and was advancing on the 3rd with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. The roofline showed a visible collapse over one section. A condemned notice on the gate had faded over years from orange to a dusty pink. Minimum bid, $400. She read the full listing twice. The property had belonged to the Aldrich family, with the last of them, Henry Aldrich III, dying in February of 1993 at 71. He had never married. No children. No clear will, which sent the estate into probate litigation that ran until 1997, when a distant cousin's claim was dismissed on procedural grounds. The county assumed control in 1998 when the estate account ran out of money for back taxes. A development company took the property in 2002 intending to demolish and build, then collapsed before breaking ground. The county reacquired it in 2004. It had been in administrative limbo ever since, assessed at 0 because the condemned structure made the land difficult to monetize and the cost of demolition exceeded any rational return. $400. 22 rooms. 4 acres inside the city limits. She spent 40 minutes looking for the catch. The catch was substantial and plain. 3 county engineering inspections over 2 decades had flagged structural concerns, the most recent in 2019 noting further deterioration in the east wing and recommending against entry. Any buyer assumed full responsibility for remediation or demolition, either of which required tens of thousands of dollars. The land, for acres inside city limits, was worth roughly $200,000 in the current market, but getting there required clearing the structure first, which required capital she didn't have and couldn't borrow. She understood that. She also called the county assessor's office and asked which specific elements had triggered each inspection flag. She called the engineering office directly and asked the same question. The woman she reached seemed momentarily surprised to be asked with that degree of specificity, but answered fully. All 3 inspections had flagged the East Wing addition exclusively. The East Wing shared no load-bearing elements with the original 1889 main house, which had passed every structural check in all 3 visits. She thought about this for 3 days. On the 3rd night, she lay on her cot and listened to her children breathe and thought about what 4 acres inside the city limits actually meant, about the specific difference between a space you own and a space you rent, about how every stability you build on rented ground is conditional in the same way that the ground underneath it is conditional. She thought about the $6,000 and the 60 days. She thought about Marcus and his jaw and the questions he'd stopped asking. She thought, even condemned, even broken, even in whatever actual state it's in, it is a roof. It is walls. No one can raise the rent on it because there is no rent. No one can sell it out from under us because we are the ones who own it. The auction was on a Thursday. She took the bus to the county administrative building, registered at the desk, and sat in a folding chair in a room with 40 other people who had come to bid on 7 different properties. The auction room smelled like old coffee and fluorescent lighting. The 40 other people were mostly developers and their associates, men in practical jackets talking in low voices and occasionally checking phones, the kind of men who attended these auctions with spreadsheets in mind, who had already decided which properties made sense at which prices and would leave the moment the bidding exceeded those thresholds. She recognized what she was looking at. She had spent years working in spaces where other people made consequential decisions, hotel conference rooms, banquet halls rented for closings and negotiations. She knew the difference between people who were there to acquire something and people who were there to protect against losing. The developers were the first kind. She was something else. She was there because she had nowhere else to go that was better than this. The Aldrich Estate went fifth. The auctioneer read the minimum bid without particular emphasis, as if $400 for 22 rooms on 4 acres was simply the unremarkable number it appeared to be on paper. The developer in the row ahead of Nadia looked up briefly from his phone and looked back down. The woman beside him said something in a low voice. Neither of them raised a hand. Nadia raised hers. She watched the room. She waited through 6 seconds that felt substantially longer, watching for another hand, watching the men in practical jackets. No other hand went up. The gavel came down with a sound that was less dramatic than she'd expected. She walked out of the county building owning a condemned Victorian mansion with 22 rooms, a partial roof collapse in the east wing, and 4 acres of land in Harker Falls, Pennsylvania. She had $33 in her wallet. She sat on the steps outside and let the fact of it settle into her body, which took a few minutes, because facts of that magnitude require time to travel the full distance from the mind to the place where they actually become real. What she felt was partly terror and partly something else that didn't yet have a name. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and called Marcus. His first question was the one she expected. Is it safe? She said the main structure is sound. The east wing is the concern, and we stay out of it. His second question was more like him. What do we do first? She said we go look at it. They went that Saturday. All 3 of them, 2 buses and a 15-minute walk from the final stop. The driveway was cracked asphalt claimed steadily from both sides by weeds and low scrub, and they walked up it single file because the clear center path was narrow. The gate had rusted open on its hinges and wouldn't close. The padlock she'd bought was going on a property she now needed to think about differently. From the foot of the portico steps the house was larger than photographs had suggested. The columns rose 20 feet to the roof of the portico. The front door was solid oak under 3 horizontal boards nailed across it with a commitment that suggested permanence. Lily stood in front of it with both hands in her pockets and looked up at the columns, then at the windows, then at the roof where the turrets stood against a pale March sky, and her expression was one of frank and uncomplicated assessment. It's big, she said. Yes, Nadia said. Is it ours? Yes. Marcus was already moving, circling the perimeter of the main building with the systematic attention he brought to problems he was trying to understand. He came back and pointed out where the brickwork changed, a slightly raised line in the foundation that marked the junction between the original 1889 construction and the East Wing addition, 2 different hands, 2 different eras. The mortar between the original bricks looked intact, he said. The East Wing's footing looked separate. The inspector had been right that they didn't share structural elements. He was 12. He'd been reading structural engineering primers on the shelter computers for 2 months because he had decided that this was information worth having. Nadia kept this fact in the same place. She kept all the things about her children that were too large to examine directly. Inside, the foyer was dark and cold and smelled of decades of sealed air and damp plaster. They got in through the loose board. The marble floor was buried under an inch of grime and plaster dust, its pattern invisible but structurally intact. No hollow resonance underfoot, no cracking at the edges. The staircase rose from the center of the space in a curve that was still graceful in its structural bones. The banister warped and split in sections, but the tread solid. The chandelier hung from the ceiling above them, its crystals so thoroughly coated in gray that they'd stopped being able to catch light and simply hung there, matte and patient, waiting for someone to bring them back to what they were. Lily walked to the center of the foyer floor and turned in a slow circle, looking up at all of it. "Is this where we live now?" she said. "Not yet," Nadia said. "We have to fix it first. All of it. As much as we can." They moved through the ground floor together that first afternoon, Nadia leading and the children close behind. The dining room opened off the left of the foyer through its original pocket doors, which were still in their tracks, the hardware tarnished but intact. The oak wainscoting ran floor to chest height around the full perimeter, buried under grime but solid when she pressed her palm against it. Beyond the dining room, a butler's pantry held its original glass front cabinets, the glass crazed in some panes but unbroken. Beyond that, the kitchen, stripped of its fixtures to the pipe stubs by someone who had come through for the copper and the porcelain and had no interest in the rest. The library was through a set of double doors off the east side of the foyer. Here the east wing's roof damage was visible, the ceiling partially open to the sky, the floors warped and blackened where moisture had reached them over the years. Nadia kept the children in the doorway, but from the threshold she could see what the room had been. Built-in shelving on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, the books long gone but the shelves still standing, still level, as if waiting to be filled again. The firewall between the library and the foyer was full brick, which was why the main house had stayed dry. Upstairs, the second floor held 8 bedrooms and 2 full bathrooms with original fixtures. Clawfoot tubs still in place, pedestal sinks intact, hexagonal black and white tile on the bathroom floors cracked in places, but mostly whole. The fixtures needed work. They were there, which was the part that mattered. From the third-floor hall window, Nadia could see the full 4 acres for the first time. Most of the property was overgrown, but the shape of what it had been was still readable in the lines of the hedgerows, which had grown wild but not disappeared, and in the stone pathways visible under decades of accumulated leaf and soil. At the far back of the property, past the old garden, a carriage house stood with its doors closed and its roof intact. She hadn't known about the carriage house. She stood at that window for a moment and did not let herself calculate what eventual restoration would cost. There was a sequence here. Survival was the first step in it. Everything else came after. The criticism came quickly, as it does when a person makes a decision that looks insane from the outside. Her sister Elena called from Pittsburgh the night of the auction, after Marcus had mentioned it in a phone call to a cousin who mentioned it to Elena, and the conversation had the quality of something Elena had spent the intervening hours preparing. "Say it to me out loud," Elena said. "You bought a condemned building with your savings." "I bought a house for $400 on 4 acres in the city. I have $433 left. A condemned house. With your children in it. The main structure is not condemned. The east wing is, and we stay out of the east wing. I have provisional occupancy. 60-day provisional. You could be out in 60 days. Or we complete the inspection list, and we stay. That's the plan." Elena was quiet for a moment. She was not a cruel person. She was afraid, which in a specific circumstance produces similar-sounding words. She said, "I want to send you some money. Not a lot, but something." Nadia thanked her and said no. The shelter supervisor, Gerald, sat with her in the common room on the morning she was leaving. He was a man who had spent 11 years watching people make decisions in crisis, and he'd learned which arguments were useful and which ones weren't. He told her quietly that the building had a history of flagged inspections and that the county could involve DCF if the remediation timeline slipped. She told him she'd read the inspection reports and drafted a sequenced list against the engineering concerns and had already spoken with the county inspector. He looked at her for a moment and then said he hoped it worked out, and she could tell he meant it. Her ex-husband, Darren, called the afternoon Marcus mentioned it to him. He told her she was being irresponsible and that he'd consult a lawyer. She offered to share the inspection reports. He didn't call back about the reports and didn't contact a lawyer, both of which were consistent with everything she knew about him. He was a man who made his fears sound like ultimatums and then lived with the fears. She had spent years learning how to account for that in practical terms. The street the estate sat on ran between $300,000 and $1 million a house, well-maintained properties on large lots in a neighborhood that had coexisted with the abandoned mansion the way you coexist with a public embarrassment, by collective agreement not to look directly at it. The abandoned estate had been there long enough that residents had largely stopped seeing it. The new reality, which involved a single mother and 2 children arriving with cleaning supplies and second-hand equipment and apparent intentions to remain, constituted a disruption of a kind that the neighborhood hadn't planned for. The couple 3 doors down sent a certified letter to the county within the first 10 days inquiring about the new owner's remediation timeline and whether habitation of a condemned structure was legally permissible. They did not knock on the gate and ask her directly. Nadia received their letter the same day she received a bill for the electric utility deposit and filed both of them in the folder labeled administrative, which was the folder where she put things that required responses she didn't have the capacity to think about until the more immediate problems were handled. Another neighbor called the city zoning office. A third filed a code enforcement complaint about overgrown vegetation on the property, which was technically accurate and which Nadia began addressing the day after receiving notice, working from the gate inward with a borrowed weed trimmer from a church 2 streets over. It took 4 Saturdays. The city housing inspector, Carl, arrived on a Tuesday. He was in his 50s and had the practical bearing of a man who'd inspected enough difficult properties to have developed a grudging respect for people who actually showed up to address them. He walked the main structure, took notes, and gave her a list. East wing off-limits pending structural certification, kitchen plumbing needed full replacement. 3 fireplaces required professional inspection before use. 6 steps on the basement stairs needed retreading. She showed him the list she'd already made from the county engineering reports, each item sequenced by safety priority with cost estimates from 2 contractors she'd already called. He looked at it longer than she expected. "You've done some homework," he said. "Some," she said. 60-day provisional, he said. "Clear the list and call me back." She kept his inspection report folded in her coat pocket for weeks, not to read it, but to confirm it was still there. A list of problems with solutions. She knew how to live with that kind of document. The first 2 weeks inside the mansion were difficult in the specific way that all beginnings are difficult when the gap between the current state and the necessary state is visible in every direction at once. The boiler was dead. 2 electric space heaters, $15 each from a salvage shop, kept the temperature in the rooms they were using above the worst of the cold. The water ran brown for 5 days before clearing. The kitchen had been stripped of its fixtures down to the pipe stub-outs, which the previous owner or someone between then and now had removed for scrap. So cooking happened on a 2-burner propane camp cooktop set up in the dining room. They slept in the room at the front of the 2nd floor, which had been large enough for the 3 of them on camping mats, and had windows that faced south, which meant afternoon light came through and warmed the space for a few hours in the late part of the day. Lily had claimed the window seat immediately, a deep stone bench under the south-facing window with a cushion long rotted away, and she spent her evenings there reading the library books that Nadia checked out on a new card issued to the property address. Marcus slept against the far wall with his back to a radiator that didn't work yet, but held residual warmth in its iron for a few hours after he ran his hand along it, which was enough to make the corner of the room marginally warmer than the rest. They ate at a folding table they'd found in the carriage house. They washed dishes in the 2nd-floor bathroom, which had a working sink. They established, within the first week, a routine so thorough that the 2nd week felt ordinary in a way the 1st week hadn't, which was the thing about routines. They made the unusual sustainable by making it familiar. The dining room wainscoting cleaned up to a warm dark walnut that caught the afternoon light through the side windows in a way that made the room feel, at certain hours, like somewhere a person might actually want to be. She cleaned from the top down. 3rd floor first. Former servants' quarters and storage rooms with water-stained ceilings and the remnants of wallpaper in small blue flowers that had mostly peeled but was still legible in corners, the pattern of another household's choice preserved in the places no one had reached. Marcus worked with her on weekends, developing a room protocol. Photograph first, then assess what was salvageable, then clear, then clean, then examine the windows and walls. Lily helped in the ways that a 7-year-old can, which is to say she was indispensable in corners and under built-in furniture, and she had an eye for things that the adults at their height missed. "What's this?" Lily would say. emerging from under a built-in desk on the third floor with a tin box painted with faded roses on the lid. "Put it down," Marcus would say. "It has something in it," Lily would say. She was usually right. The tin held a collection of buttons, shell and brass, and a few that might have been bone. A leather calendar case pressed into the back of a closet had the year 1988 embossed on the cover and, inside, the handwriting of someone who'd kept appointments in a style that suggested both orderliness and habit. A wooden box on the highest shelf held a set of drafting pencils in a deteriorated velvet liner, still sharp, each one initialed in small letters along the barrel with initials that were not those of the last Aldrich. H, W, V, the letters read, in a hand too precise for anything but intention. Lily put the pocket watch on the windowsill of the room they'd claimed as hers. She wound it every morning. It kept time. The house gave itself back in sections. The foyer marble revealed a deep charcoal and white pattern once the grime came off, section by section, over 2 weeks of work. The staircase was solid once the split treads were replaced with salvaged boards. 3 fireplaces on the second floor were certified sound for $140, which she treated not as an expense, but as infrastructure, the same way she treated the space heaters. The plumbing estimate came in at $14,000. The east wing structural reinforcement at $22,000. She thanked both contractors, put the estimates in a folder, and kept cleaning. She found other things during that work that the contractors and the lawyers and the county assessors had not found, because they hadn't looked the way a person looks when they are cleaning rather than inspecting. Behind the baseboards in the master bedroom, a shallow recess in the plaster held a wrapped oilskin package. 2 letters, brittle but legible, dated 1954 and addressed to Henry from a gallery in Geneva. She couldn't read the French, but she photographed the pages. In the attic, along the north wall under 3 decades of insulation that had been laid over the original boards, she found a series of crates, wooden, solid, stenciled on the outside in stenciled black letters with codes she didn't recognize. The crates were empty, all of them, but the stenciling was not the stenciling of a furniture company or a moving service. It was the kind of coding that belonged to inventory. The carriage house, which she explored on the 3rd weekend, held what appeared to be decades of stored maintenance equipment, rusted garden implements, a push mower from the 1970s, oil cans for a vehicle that no longer existed. But along the back wall, on a workbench that had clearly been used for careful close work, she found a collection of small tools, jeweler's tools, and beside them a set of cotton gloves of the type conservators use when handling things that should not be touched with bare hands. The gloves were stiff with age. They'd been used and left, not discarded. She filed all of it in the same place. She kept the information from the Gazette profile, things she hadn't yet figured out what to do with. There is a particular kind of work that exists past the question of whether you can afford to continue. Nadia had found it before, across the years of raising 2 children mostly alone on wages that left no margin, across the months of applications and rejections, across the 8 months on Clement Street. The work where you stop calculating because the calculation produces the same answer every time and the answer is not useful, where you move simply because moving is the only alternative to stopping, and stopping hasn't been decided. She read what she could find about Henry Aldrich III, which was limited in a way that itself felt like information. The family had been publicly visible through the first third of the 20th century. Charles Aldrich, who built the house in 1889, had been the kind of wealthy man that era produced in some numbers. His name on institutional buildings, his presence in the social pages, his photograph in the local histories. His son Henry II had maintained the family position through the Depression with difficulty, but intact. Henry III had inherited in 1952, at 31, and had spent the next 4 decades in a withdrawal from public life so thorough that by the time the Harker Falls Gazette ran a retrospective after his death in February of 1993, the reporter who wrote it couldn't find a photograph from the previous 20 years or a single person who'd been inside the estate since the mid-1970s. The profile was 4 columns long and consisted mostly of what it couldn't establish. He'd attended MIT briefly in the early 1940s before a medical deferment from military service. He'd managed the family's remaining investments conservatively and apparently profitably, though the public record didn't show the details. He'd traveled extensively in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, which the reporter noted in a single sentence without elaboration. He'd appeared at no public events. He'd given no interviews. He'd answered no correspondence that survived in any accessible archive. In the article's penultimate paragraph, sourced to an anonymous former acquaintance who had visited the estate in 1971 and hadn't been invited back, there was this. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. He had assembled what the acquaintance described as an extraordinary private collection of art and historical objects, things you'd expect to find in a museum, not a private house. The acquaintance had seen only 2 rooms, and only briefly. He didn't know the scope of it. He just knew that what he'd seen was not what you expected to see in a house in Harker Falls, Pennsylvania. The probate inventory conducted after Henry III's death had found the estate largely empty of personal property. Either the collection had been removed before he died, or it had been stored somewhere the lawyers hadn't examined. Nadia read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the phone down and sat with the information in the way she sat with information she hadn't yet figured out how to use. She went further. She found the probate court records from the estate proceedings in the county clerk's online database, and she read through them over several evenings at the kitchen table. The inventory had been conducted in March of 1993 by a firm from Pittsburgh. The lead assessor had listed the contents of 18 rooms in the main house and filed a report that ran to 4 pages and noted, without apparent concern, that the property contained minimal personal effects, no art of obvious value, and no significant collections of any kind. The assessor had spent 1 day in the building. The report mentioned the basement briefly, storage, coal equipment, no items of value. The oilskin letters from Geneva were not in the report. The crates in the attic were not in the report. The conservation tools on the carriage house workbench were not in the report. Either the assessors had missed them, which was possible given that they'd spent 1 day in a 22-room Victorian house, or those items had arrived at the property after the inventory, which was impossible given the timeline of the estate proceedings, or the assessors had found them and decided they weren't relevant. She also pulled newspaper records from the Harker Falls Gazette archive, which the local library had digitized back to 1890. She read every mention of the Aldrich name, which took the better part of 2 evenings. Charles and Henry II appeared regularly. Charitable donations, civic events, business announcements. Henry III appeared 3 times before 1960 and not again afterward. The last mention was a brief social note from April of 1959, placing him at a reception at a hotel in the city, accompanied by an unnamed business associate visiting from Zurich. After 1959, Henry Aldrich III was, as far as the public record was concerned, simply a man who lived in a large house on the edge of the city and was not available for comment on anything. The basement revealed its own geography over the weeks they worked. It ran beneath the full footprint of the main house, divided by low stone walls into 3 connected sections with arched doorways between them. The first section held the coal furnace from the 1920s, a cast-iron installation the size of a small car that had been decommissioned when the house converted to oil heat sometime in the 1950s and then simply left in place because removing it would have required disassembly, and the Aldriches had apparently decided that was somebody else's eventual problem. She ran LED work lights through on extension cords from the ground floor and spent 4 days clearing the section of wooden crates, deteriorated equipment, and the fine black residue that coal systems deposit permanently into every surrounding surface. The second section was older than the first, the walls built from fieldstone and old brick rather than the poured concrete she'd seen upstairs, the floor packed earth rather than a laid surface. Wooden shelving along one wall had rotted to the point where contact caused sections to collapse inward. It smelled different from the rooms above, denser, drier, something like the inside of an old book amplified to the scale of a room. On her first pass, she'd photographed it, noted the shelving as a removal task, and moved to other priorities. She hadn't examined every wall. She told the children to stay out of the basement. The floor was uneven, the lighting was incomplete, and there were things she hadn't yet assessed. Marcus accepted this without argument, which was typical. Lily accepted it with the kind of partial compliance that lasts until something more interesting appears. The more interesting thing appeared on a Saturday in April, 5 weeks after they'd moved in. Nadia was on the second floor pulling damaged plaster from the wall of what she was beginning to think of as Marcus's room, her back to the doorway, when she heard Lily's footsteps on the basement stairs. She recognized them, light and quick, with the particular rhythm of a child moving towards something rather than wandering. She registered the sound for a moment before registering what it meant. "Lily, come up here. In a minute. Now, Lily." "Mama." Her daughter's voice came back from somewhere that sounded further down than a basement floor. "Come look." Nadia set down the scraper and went. She moved through the first cellar section with her flashlight, past the cold coal furnace, through the low arch into the second section. The smell shifted as she crossed the threshold, that older, denser quality she'd noticed before, but more concentrated when she stood still in it. She swept the beam across the walls, the rotted shelving, the packed earth floor. Lily was at the far end of the room, in front of a door. It was narrow, set flush into the fieldstone wall on iron hinges that had gone nearly black with age. Nadia had seen it on her earlier visits and registered it as a root cellar access or an original coal delivery passage, the kind of utility door that 19th century houses include in their basements, and that rarely leads anywhere significant. She hadn't opened it. There'd been nothing to suggest she should. Lily had it open. "I told you not to come down here," Nadia said. "I know," Lily said. She was not apologetic. She had the expression of someone who has encountered something that justifies the rule-breaking, who is in fact somewhat surprised that a rule stood between her and this information for this long. "Mama," she said, "the stairs don't end." Nadia stopped. "What?" Lily stepped back from the open doorway. "I went in," she said. "I found stairs and I went down and I kept going and there was no bottom. The stairs just keep going." Nadia crossed the room and pointed her flashlight through the doorway. Stone stairs, descending. Cut stone, not poured, worn smooth in the center from years of use. The walls close on either side and bricked with care. They curved slightly to the left as they went, which meant the beam couldn't show her how far they continued. From the opening, cool and dry air moved steadily upward, not the passive cold of deep soil. Controlled, the kind of temperature that requires a system to maintain. "How far did you go?" Nadia asked. Lily counted on her fingers. 27 steps. "Then I came back." Nadia did the arithmetic without meaning to. 27 steps below a basement floor that was already 10 feet below street level would put the base of those stairs somewhere between 35 and 50 feet underground, depending on the riser height. That was commercial foundation depth. It was not the depth of anything that belonged beneath a residential property built in Harker Falls in 1889. Root cellars were shallow. Coal access was shallow. Service passages were shallow. Nothing in the residential vocabulary of a Victorian house required a staircase descending 50 feet into the earth. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The dry air kept moving upward, faint and steady, the breath of a space that had been held at a constant temperature for a very long time by something mechanical and still functioning. "Go get your brother," she said. Lily's footsteps receded back through the cellar sections and up the basement stairs. Nadia stayed at the doorway, her flashlight beam finding stone and shadows and more stairs. She thought about the probate inventory that had found the estate empty of valuables. She thought about the single paragraph in the retrospective, the extraordinary collection no one had publicly seen, the rooms the anonymous acquaintance had glimpsed for a few minutes in 1971 and never described precisely, because he hadn't had time to look closely enough. She thought about a man who had spent 4 decades becoming invisible in this house, who had traveled through post-war Europe when it was full of displaced collections and disrupted estates, who had died alone and left no instructions about what he'd spent his life gathering. She thought, for $100. From above her came the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the basement stairs. Marcus first, then Lily. She heard Lily explain something in fragments as they crossed the first section, and then both of them were in the doorway beside her, looking at the descending stairs in the flashlight beam. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He did his own version of the calculation, visible in the set of his face. Then he said, quietly, that airflow isn't natural. No, you need a system for that. Something running below. Yes. He looked at her. How deep does it go? I don't know. Lily pressed close against her mother's arm. Are we going down? Nadia looked at the stairs. She looked at the dark curve of them and the dry, cool air and the worn center of each step, where years of use had polished the stone smooth in a way that required a great many passages over a long stretch of time. Someone had been going up and down these stairs often enough and for long enough that the stone remembered it. She thought about who and what they'd been carrying and where. Not tonight, she said. She was aware, even as she said it, that she was making a decision she would be unable to fully explain to herself later, because the honest reason was not caution. She was not afraid of what was at the bottom of those stairs. She was afraid of what the answer would require from her once she knew it. Some information changes the nature of a situation, and once the situation has changed, the version of it that existed before is no longer recoverable. She needed one more night inside the version where she didn't know. She closed the door. She photographed it 3 times from different angles, the door itself, the iron hinges, the stone wall around the frame. She noted the way the wood of the door had not warped or rotted, which meant it had been maintained or protected from moisture in a way that was inconsistent with its apparent age and the condition of the cellar around it. She photographed the placement of it in the room. She memorized the particular way the stone had been cut to receive the frame, the precision of the work of someone who was building for permanence and knew it. Then she led her children back up through the cellar sections, up the basement stairs, into the kitchen where the camp cooktop still held warmth from dinner. She made tea. She sat at the table and listened to Marcus build and test hypotheses in his methodical way, each one more specific than the last, while Lily dismissed each one in favor of something more interesting, and she drank her tea and didn't contribute and let them talk, because she was thinking about something she couldn't yet say out loud. After the children were in their sleeping bags, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone and searched for everything she hadn't yet found about Henry Aldrich III, the years of his European travel, the estate sale records from neighboring counties, the art market in Pennsylvania in the 1950s and 1960s, the directories of private collections assembled in that era by American industrialists with inherited money and no public obligation to account for how they spent it. What she found was not specific to Henry. It was contextual. In the years after the Second World War, the art market had moved in ways that were not always formally documented. Collections displaced from European estates and institutions had found their way into private hands through channels that were sometimes clear and sometimes not, and American buyers with cash and the discretion that comes from having no public profile had acquired things that couldn't be discussed openly because discussing them invited questions that the sellers preferred not to answer. A man of Henry III's particular combination of qualities, inherited capital, extended European travel, total aversion to visibility, would have been exactly the kind of buyer that particular market accommodated. She didn't find his name in any record. She hadn't expected to. A man who'd spent 40 years making himself invisible in a house in Harker Falls would not have left a documentary trail in any archive that was accessible through a county library database and a phone with a cracked screen. But the stairs went down 50 feet. They were worn smooth in the center from use. The air moving up from them was controlled and dry and had been maintained by something mechanical for long enough that the mechanism had become background, unremarkable, expected by whatever space it served. Nadia set down her phone and looked at the kitchen, the camp cooktop, the folding table, the contractor bags folded neatly because they were expensive enough to use until they gave out. She looked at the doorway into the hall, beyond which her children were sleeping in their bags on camping mats in rooms they were beginning to think of as theirs. She thought about what she had. $411 invested in this house. weeks of work, a provisional occupancy permit, and a sequenced list of repairs. 2 kids who had not complained once, not once in 5 weeks, about a single thing that was hard. Somewhere below her, beneath the house she'd bought for $400.11 on a Tuesday in March, something waited. It had been waiting for 31 years and would wait one more night while she decided how to go toward it, and what to bring, and whether she was prepared for what she was going to find at the bottom of 27 steps and beyond the point where a 7-year-old had turned around and come back to get her mother. She turned off the work light and sat in the dark kitchen for a few minutes, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting with the fact of the house around her, the weight of it, the solidity of the walls. Then she went to find her sleeping bag and did not sleep for a long time. She went down on Sunday morning, before the children were awake. She'd planned it that way. She lay in her sleeping bag for an hour after the light changed, listening to Marcus breathe and Lily make the small sounds she made when she was dreaming, and she thought about what it meant to go first. It meant she could come back up and tell them it was nothing, if it was nothing. A root cellar, an old sump tunnel, something disappointing that wouldn't keep her up again the way she'd been kept up the night before, lying in the dark, doing arithmetic about steps and depth and dry air. It also meant she could come back up and tell them something else, if it was something else. She got up carefully, dressed in the dark, took the flashlight and her phone, and went downstairs. The cellar smelled different in the early morning. The day's activity pulled certain things out of the basement air and replaced them with the smell of the house above, propane and old wood, and the particular combination that meant the heater had run in the night. In the morning, with the house cold and still, the cellar smelled like itself. Old stone, packed earth, the residue of a coal era. She moved through the first section without pausing, past the furnace, through the arch. The LED work lights were off. She navigated by flashlight. The second section was exactly as she'd left it. The narrow door in the fieldstone wall was closed. She stood in front of it for a moment, then opened it. The stairs went down. She'd known they would. She'd been told they would. She hadn't fully understood until she was standing at the top of them with her flashlight illuminating the first 10 steps and the slow curve to the left and the darkness below, what 27 steps below a basement actually felt like as a physical commitment. There was no railing. The walls were close on both sides, her shoulder brushing the left side as she turned with the curve. The steps were wide enough for both feet flat, and the worn center of each one was unmistakable close up, a shallow concave. Smoothness where the stone had given way over decades of weight and movement. Someone had walked these stairs so many times the stone remembered it. She counted as she went. Lily had said 27. She counted to 30 before the stairs leveled and widened, and her flashlight swept into a space that wasn't a passage anymore. It was an antechamber, roughly circular, maybe 15 feet across, the walls the same old brick as the lower section of the cellar above, but cleaner, maintained, the mortar intact, and the surface clear of the grime and mineral deposits that characterized old construction left to itself. The floor was poured concrete, smooth and level, joined to the walls without gaps. The ceiling was 8 feet high, framed with stone lintels that had been cut and set with a precision that had nothing to do with utility and everything to do with intention. On the far side of the antechamber was a door. It was not a wooden door with iron hinges. It was steel, set into a reinforced frame, with a wheel lock mechanism in the center and a separate keypad to the right of it. The keypad's small screen was dark, but the unit had a faint green light at the bottom, a standby indicator, which meant it was drawing power from somewhere, which meant the electrical system behind the wall was still active. Nadia stood in the antechamber and looked at the door for a while. The dry air moved steadily from its direction, which meant the climate system was on the other side. Whatever was behind that door was being maintained, had been maintained for 31 years, or longer, or however long it had been since Henry Aldrich III had last come down these stairs. The system behind that door had been running through every year she'd been working at the hotel, through every eviction notice, through every month on Clement Street, through the Tuesday morning in March when she'd raised her hand in a room full of developers and become the owner of the house above. She approached the door and examined the wheel lock. It was not locked in the sense she'd expected. There was no combination dial, no code visible, just the wheel and a lever release beside it. She tried the wheel. It turned. Stiffly at first, with the resistance of disuse, but it turned, and as it turned she could hear things happening inside the door. Mechanical things, the sequential release of bolts. She counted 4. Then she pulled the lever. The door opened toward her. The air that came out was cool and clean, with a quality she couldn't name at first, something between old paper and mineral, the smell of a controlled space maintained over time. Lights came on inside as the door moved. Not all at once. They activated in sequence, motion sensors, or a door trigger, running away from her into a space much larger than the antechamber. She stepped through. The first room was long, perhaps 40 feet, with a low vaulted ceiling and walls lined on both sides with wooden racks, floor to ceiling, the kind that wine cellars used, but not holding bottles. Each compartment held a frame. Canvas stretched over wooden supports, wrapped at the edges in breathable padding and stored vertically in the climate-controlled dark that was now illuminated by overhead strips activating in sequence, moving away from her down the length of the room. She stood still for a moment and let the lights finish. The room had the quality of a place that had been waiting to be looked at. She didn't know how to explain that impression more precisely. It was in the air, in the steadiness of the temperature, in the arrangement of the racks, which were not the arrangement of someone who stored things carelessly, but of someone who thought about the sequence a person would follow when walking through them, who had considered what it would feel like to enter this room for the first time. Henry had known someone would enter for the first time. He had built the room for that moment as much as for the decades of preservation that preceded it. She walked slowly. Each frame had a card attached to the front, a small rectangle of heavy cream stock in the same precise handwriting she'd seen elsewhere in the house. Title, medium, approximate date, and 1 or 2 additional lines she would need more time to fully parse. She stopped at the nearest frame and read. The name on the card she recognized from an art history textbook she'd read at the public library 2 years ago, when Marcus had a school project on Impressionism and she'd read alongside him, because she liked to read alongside whatever the children were studying. The name on the card was followed by a date in the 1880s and a note below in smaller letters. Acquired Geneva, 1957, authenticated. She looked at the painting. The edge of canvas visible beyond the frame showed paint laid thickly, brush marks visible as individual gestures made by a hand that had died before anyone now living was born. She didn't touch it. She looked at it, and then moved on. She read cards as she went. She stopped at a painting whose card named a painter she knew from a museum visit she'd taken Marcus on when he was 7, before everything changed, a day trip to Philadelphia on a discount bus ticket she'd bought 3 weeks in advance, because that was the only way she could afford the bus. She'd stood with him in front of a landscape and read the label aloud, and he'd asked why someone would paint the same pond 40 times, and she'd said, because each time the light was different. The name on the card in front of her now was that same painter. The date on the card was 1895. The note below read, acquired through Bertrand Estate, Paris, 1954. Believed to be from a group of works removed from estate inventory, 1942. She stood in front of it for longer than she'd stood in front of the others. Then she moved on. She read more cards. The names on the cards were names she recognized from textbooks and museum postcards and the art reference section she'd sometimes used during breaks at the hotel when a guest left a coffee table book on the lobby chair. Beside the recognized names were others she didn't know, but the dates were consistent. Late 19th century, early 20th. Several cards, scattered through the racks, had a small asterisk in the lower right corner. Beside the asterisk, a note in smaller letters. Provenance uncertain, believed destroyed 1940 to 1945. Acquired through Fleischmann Estate, 1953. Or, listed missing. Jeu de Paume inventory, 1942. She stopped at one with that notation and read it twice. Listed missing. Believed destroyed. But it was here. In a padded rack in a temperature-controlled room under a Victorian house in Harker Falls, Pennsylvania. One among many things that the world thought were gone, and that turned out to have gone somewhere specific instead. She counted the racks as she moved through the room. 26, double-sided, each holding between 3 and 8 paintings depending on size. She did not try to count the paintings themselves. The number forming at the edges of her arithmetic was too large to hold while she was still moving. The first room opened through an arched doorway into a second. This one was wider. Along the left wall, heavy industrial shelving, floor to ceiling, bolted to anchor points in the brick. On the shelving, objects. some in sealed glass cases, some resting on padded supports under breathable fabric. The cases that were clear enough to see through held things she had to look at twice before she understood she was actually seeing them and not imagining the kind of thing she might see if she'd seen too many museum photographs. Ceramic vessels shaped in the style of the ancient world. Bronze figures with the particular oxidation that meant real age. Scrolls and sealed tubes, each one labeled with a date and a place of origin in the same handwriting that ran through everything else in the vault. Coins laid flat in trays under glass, each one individually marked, the labels so small she had to lean close. She leaned close to several of them and read. The labels gave names of empires and dates of minting and, in some cases, the name of the person who had owned the coin before Henry. She kept moving. The right wall of the second room held something she had been aware of since she'd first crossed the threshold, and her peripheral vision had registered it, and her mind had declined to process it immediately, storing the information until she was ready to face it directly. On a reinforced platform, arranged in rows 3 across and extending back into the room, were metal bars. Rectangular and uniform, a color in the overhead lighting that was not approximate gold, but actual gold in the sense of refined, dense, specific. The platform they sat on was a different material from the surrounding floor, something rated to carry the weight. She walked to the stack and looked at one bar closely. It was stamped. The stamp showed a refinery mark, a weight, and a finest grade. 400 troy ounces. She ran her eyes along the nearest row, counting. Then she estimated the depth of the stack, counting visible rows and assuming the same pattern continued behind the front face. She multiplied the numbers in her head and stood very still for a moment with the result. Then she looked away and kept moving because she needed to see the full extent of what was here before she let herself think about any single part of it. The second room opened into a third. The third room was the largest. The ceiling rose to 10 or 11 feet, and the space was wide enough that when she walked through the doorway, the overhead lights activated in a sequence that took several seconds to complete, illuminating the room section by section the way a stage reveals itself, one area then the next, building toward a whole. She stood in the entrance and let it happen. Cases, glass, sealed, internally lit, arranged in a grid with wide aisles between them. Inside the cases, documents, paper and parchment and vellum, each item mounted on acid-free support, each one separated from its neighbors by protective material, each one labeled in the same hand. She moved to the nearest case and looked at the first item. A letter. 2 pages, handwritten, the script of the 18th century. The signature at the bottom was not legible through the glass at this distance, but the label beside the case read, autograph letter signed, dated 1778, concerning winter encampment logistics. Accompanied by authentication certificate from the Library of Congress. Acquired 1956. She moved to the next case and the next. Maps in one section. Illuminated manuscripts in another, the pages visible through the glass in colors that had no business looking as fresh as they did in a document whose label gave a date in the 1300s. A section of cases holding musical scores, handwritten notation on yellowed pages, each labeled with a composer's name she recognized from the radio and from music classes and from years of passing record stores and neighborhoods she no longer lived in. One case held a single sheet of paper behind glass, maybe 10 by 14 inches, covered in notation in a hand distinctly different from the precise modern handwriting of the label cards. The label read, autograph manuscript page, undated, attributed through handwriting analysis. Acquired Turin, 1961. She stood in front of that case for a long time. When she finally came out of the third room, back through the second and the first, and through the vault door, and up the 30 steps, and through the cellar sections, and up the basement stairs, the light through the kitchen windows had moved considerably. It was past noon. She had been below for more than 3 hours. Marcus was at the kitchen table with a book. He looked at her when she came in, taking in whatever her face was doing, and he didn't speak immediately. She said, "Get your sister. I need you both to come downstairs." He closed the book and called Lily. The 3 of them descended together. Nadia first, then Marcus, then Lily, who held the back of her mother's jacket on the stairs even though she had gone down alone the day before. The antechamber stopped all 3 of them briefly. Lily made a sound. Marcus went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Nadia opened the vault door again, and the lights activated in their sequence. "Oh," said Lily. Marcus said nothing for the length of time it took the lights to finish coming on. He looked at the first room with the same focused attention he'd given the facade of the house on their first visit, systematic, moving from one detail to the next, assembling a whole from parts. Then he said, "How many paintings?" "I stopped counting," Nadia said. He nodded. He wasn't surprised. He was already working the problem. They walked the first room, reading cards. Lily touched the outer edge of one frame with one finger, not the canvas, just the wooden edge, and pulled her hand back quickly as if she'd thought better of it. Marcus moved along the opposite rack with his hands behind his back, reading each label in order, his lips moving slightly the way they did when he was memorizing. Halfway through the room, he stopped at one of the cards with an asterisk and read the full note. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, without turning, "These ones with the stars. They were lost." "Some of them," Nadia said. "Henry thought they were going to be destroyed. He got them out." Marcus was quiet. "Then, that's why he built this. That's part of it." He kept moving. In the second room, Lily put her face close to a glass case and looked at a ceramic vessel whose label gave its age as approximately 2,000 years. She didn't say anything. She just looked at it for a while. Nadia went to the gold. She made herself calculate it this time. She pulled up the current gold price on her phone, which required going back up to the kitchen where there was signal and then coming back down with the number in her head. She stood in front of the stack and counted the bars visible in a single row. She estimated the rows visible and those extending behind. She multiplied. The number that came out was wrong. She did it again with different estimates. The range of numbers that resulted was wide enough that she sat down on the concrete floor in the aisle between the shelving and the gold and stayed there for a while. Marcus came and sat beside her. Neither of them said anything. They sat like that for maybe 2 minutes. Then Lily appeared in the doorway between the second and third rooms, holding something small and leather-bound. "Put that down," Marcus said. "There's writing in it," Lily said. "Is it yours?" Marcus said. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. Then she said, "It's in here. And this is ours." She was not entirely wrong. Nadia held out her hand, and Lily brought her the notebook. It was an inventory. 37 handwritten pages organized by category and room, each entry giving a brief description, a date of acquisition, a source, an estimated value at time of acquisition, and a column in the right margin that held either an asterisk or a blank. She understood as she read through the first several pages that the asterisks corresponded to items whose provenance was complicated in the way the painting cards had suggested, acquired through disrupted estates, under circumstances that the post-war art market had made possible and that the present-day art world would require careful examination to assess. The values in the column were in the currency of the 1950s and 1960s. She had no way to convert them without doing substantial research. But even without conversion, the ranges were visible. The painting section ran between 5 and 6 figures per item. The artifacts and manuscripts ran generally lower, with several marked separately that reached into 6 figures. At the back of the notebook, on the last written page, was a total in large numbers with a date beside it, 1971. She photographed the page. Then she looked at the number again. In 1971 dollars, the estimated total value of the collection as documented in the notebook was $34 million. She knew enough about what had happened to art markets in the decades since 1971 to understand that $34 million in 1971 was a number that had traveled a very long distance from that year to this one. She needed to research exactly how far. She set the notebook aside. The third room had 2 things she hadn't noticed on her first pass because they were on a shelf behind the far row of document cases, which she hadn't reached before she'd gone back up to get the children. A wooden box, sealed, with a brass clasp, and set on top of it, an envelope made of heavy cream stock, sealed, a single line on the front and handwriting she now recognized immediately. "For whoever finds this when I am gone." She stood holding the envelope. Marcus had come into the third room and was working his way through the document cases from left to right in each row, reading labels. Lily had settled cross-legged on the floor near the entrance with the inventory notebook in her lap, turning pages carefully. The climate system hummed steadily above their heads. The lights held their steady temperature, unchanging. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was 3 pages, folded once, written in the same precise hand as the documentation, but smaller, more compressed, with a quality that suggested the writer was choosing each word with awareness of the space he had and the time he might be asking someone else to spend on it. It was dated March 14th, 1989. She checked the date twice. Henry had been 67 in 1989. He had died in 1993, which meant he had written this letter 4 years before his death, in a period when he'd still been lucid and deliberate enough to choose March rather than any other month, to choose the 14th rather than any other day, to draft and revise this document until it said what he needed it to say. This was not a deathbed letter. It was a prepared letter, written by someone who had decided exactly what he wanted to leave behind. My name is Henry Aldrich. I am 67 years old, and my health is declining in ways I will not detail, because the details are not the point. The point is that I have built something, and I don't know whether it will outlast me. I have no family to leave it to and no institution I trust to take it without converting it immediately to a valuation exercise and making decisions from that valuation rather than from the things that actually matter. So I am leaving this letter for a stranger. I don't know who you are. I don't know when you'll find this or what the world will look like when you do. But you are here, which means you got past the door, which means you had either the right key or the right amount of determination. And I've learned that those two things frequently belong to the same person. She read that line again. The right key or the right amount of determination. Lily had opened the door on the stairs not because she had a key, but because she was a 7-year-old who saw a door and opened it, which in its own way was the second thing. She turned the page. I started buying in Europe in 1952. I was 30 years old. My father had just died. I had money I hadn't earned and didn't know what to do with, and I went abroad because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't here. It was 7 years after the end of a war that had killed many people I'd grown up near and should have been with, except that my heart had a defect the Army doctor identified in 1943 that the Army decided was incompatible with service. I spent the war years in Harker Falls, managing the family accounts, growing richer while others were killed. I don't know how to describe what that does to a person in terms that don't sound like complaint, so I won't try. What I can tell you is that in 1952, arriving in Paris for the first time, I saw what the war had done to the cultural life of Europe. Not the physical destruction, though that was visible. The displacement. Things that had been in places for generations. Paintings in gallery collections, sculptures in churches, manuscripts in libraries, had been moved, hidden, looted, scattered, and in many cases never returned to anything close to their original context. I began to understand that there was a category of thing that had survived the war but was still in danger. Things that existed in private hands or unsettled estates or informal arrangements. Things whose ownership chain had been broken by those years and whose future depended entirely on who happened to encounter them next. I started buying, at first with the intention of doing something appropriate eventually. Donating to museums, establishing provenances, finding the right institutions. But the more I bought, the more I understood that the right institutions were not yet ready for what I was bringing them. The questions they would ask about origin, about the years 1939 through 1945 specifically, were questions without clean answers for many of the things I was acquiring. Not because they were stolen, not most of them, but because the people who had owned them were dead and the documentation was incomplete and the institutions were not equipped to hold complicated things with good faith. So I held them instead. She turned to the second page. I built the room beneath my house between 1958 and 1962. The engineers were Swiss, and the stonemason was from the Dalmatian coast. A man who understood stone the way you understand something you've worked with since childhood. The climate system came from a specialist who was accustomed to working for clients who did not explain their reasons. I paid cash for all of it. I told no one what I was building. The work was done in sections over 4 years, by different teams who each understood only their portion of it. What I built is not a vault in the sense that banks use the word. It is closer to a library, except that libraries are open to the public, and this has been closed to everyone, including me, for the past 3 years, because I can no longer manage the stairs. What is here? He had organized the inventory into a brief list, the only list in the letter, the only departure from his running prose. 53 paintings. Of these, 42 are definitively authenticated, and 11 are authenticated to a high degree of confidence, but with incomplete documentation. Their combined estimated value in 1989 was approximately $120 million. In the present day, it will be considerably more. 1,408 individual artifacts from the ancient world, acquired primarily through estate sales in Italy, Greece, and Turkey between 1953 and 1976. 312 documents, letters, manuscripts, and printed text from the 15th century through the 20th, including items whose loss was recorded in institutional inventories during the war years and that I found in private hands afterward. 1,140 kilograms of gold in bar form, refined to investment grade. I acquired this over 40 years as protection against institutional failure. It has sat here and used because no failure severe enough to require it has arrived in my lifetime. Perhaps it will in yours. Perhaps it won't. Either way, it is here. A climate control system rated for 100 years of continuous operation, last serviced in 1987. There is a maintenance manual in the wooden box beside this letter. The system will require attention approximately every 15 years. The necessary components are listed in the manual. She stopped reading. 1,140 kilograms. She converted the weight on her phone. 2,512 pounds. She looked at the gold price she'd pulled up earlier. She multiplied. The number that came out of that multiplication was large enough that she set the phone face down on the concrete floor, slowly, and looked at the letter for a moment without reading it. Then she picked up the phone again and kept going. The rest of the letter was on the final page. She could see by the handwriting that it had been written more slowly than the preceding sections, the letters more deliberate, as if Henry had been aware that this part was the part he hadn't been able to draft, and revised the way he drafted and revised everything else in his life. I have thought about what I want from whoever finds this, he had written, and I have tried to be honest with myself about what I actually have the right to want, given that I will be dead and in no position to enforce preferences or accept consequences. I don't want it sold. That is the honest answer. Not because money is worthless, but because selling it disperses it, and dispersal is the thing that made these objects vulnerable in the first place. What's here belongs together. The objects tell a story together that they cannot tell in pieces, in different rooms on different continents, owned by different people who will never put them in conversation with each other. What I want is for it to be seen. Not by collectors. Not at auction. Not by people who write checks and hang things in private hallways where only guests who are also wealthy enough to be invited to dinner will ever see them. By anyone who wants to look. In the way that museums work at their best, which means open doors and explained context and the assumption that the person walking through deserves to understand what they're seeing. I know this is complicated. The provenance questions I mentioned are real. There are items here that will require careful legal work before they can be displayed publicly. There are items whose full history I don't know and never will. I am not asking you to ignore those complications. I am asking you to solve them, which is different, and which I acknowledge is a great deal to ask of a person I've never met. But you are here. Whatever brought you here, whether it was curiosity or desperation or something else entirely, it brought you to the right place. I've believed for many years that the right person would find this eventually. I don't have a logical foundation for that belief. I built this place on a kind of faith that I'm unable to explain and unwilling to abandon, and I don't know how to stop having it now that I'm at the end. One last thing. I don't know the present-day value of what's here. I've given you my estimate for 1989. The gold is whatever the market says on the day you check. The art is less predictable. The market for what's here has changed considerably since I acquired most of it, and will change again in ways I can't see. But if you are asking whether this is enough to matter, whether it is enough to be worth the complications and the difficulty and the decisions you are going to have to make, the answer is yes. More than enough. Enough that what you do with it will determine things that I cannot determine myself, for people who do not yet exist. I built this for the future. I'm leaving it to whoever the future sends me. Henry Charles Aldrich III, March 14, 1989, she folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. She sat still for a moment in the third room of the vault, in the temperature-controlled air, in the light that had been running for 31 years above cases full of things whose loss the world had recorded and whose existence it didn't know about, and she tried to let the full weight of what she'd just read settle into the place where it actually belonged. She thought about Henry writing this in 1989, in a house that was already showing the signs of long disuse, already beginning the slow retreat that would consume it over the following decades. He had been 67 and unwell and entirely alone. He had come down these stairs and sat somewhere in this vault. The same lights overhead, the same climate control, the same gold on the same platform. And he had written this letter in the same hand that had labeled every card and every case and every inventory page. And he had addressed it to no one and left it for everyone. She thought about what it had cost him to stop being able to manage the stairs. What it had felt like to seal this place for the last time, knowing he was sealing it for good. She thought about a 7-year-old who hadn't been told not to touch things, touching the edge of a painting frame, and then pulling her hand back because she'd thought better of it without being asked to. Marcus was standing in the doorway. He had been watching her for a while, she thought. He said, "How much?" She said, "A lot." "How much is a lot?" She looked at the inventory notebook. She looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about the gold and the paintings and the document cases and the maintenance manual in the wooden box and the 31 years of a clock that had kept running while the house above it fell apart. She said, "I need to do more research before I know the exact number. 480 million is an estimate. It might be more." He was quiet for a long moment. He was 12 years old, and the number was too large for any framework he currently had, which was visible in his face in the particular way that very large things become visible, not as comprehension, but as the temporary absence of it. He said, "More than we'd ever need." "Yes." "More than we could spend." "Yes." A pause. Then, "So that's not what it's for." She looked at him. That, she thought, was the question Henry had been waiting 31 years for someone to ask. She said, "No, that's not what it's for." Then he said, "What do we do?" It was the right question. It was the only question, actually, because everything else about this situation followed from it. How they held this information, who they told, what they owed to Henry's instruction and what they owed to themselves, and what they owed to the two children who were in this room with her and would be affected by every version of what came next. She didn't answer him right away. She looked at the cases, the carefully mounted documents, the labels in Henry's handwriting that had been written decades ago with the knowledge that someone would eventually stand where she was standing and read them. She thought about what he'd asked. She thought about the specific word he'd used, seen. Not owned. Not secured. Not monetized. Seen. By anyone who wants to look. She thought about what it meant that a 36-year-old former hotel housekeeper with $400 and a provisional occupancy permit was the one who'd found it. She didn't think it was accident. She also wasn't sure it was destiny, because destiny was a word that asked more of a situation than most situations could support. But something had brought her to the auction listing on a shelter computer in March, and something had made her raise her hand when no one else did, and something had sent Lily into a basement she'd been told to stay out of on a Saturday afternoon in April. Whether that something was luck or logic or the specific kind of faith that Henry had described in his letter, she didn't know. Maybe it didn't matter what you called it. What mattered was what she did now. She stood up. She put the letter in her pocket. She picked up the wooden box with the maintenance manual. She looked at Marcus. She said, "We go upstairs. We sit with this for a while. We don't tell anyone yet. And then we figure it out." Lily was in the first room, asleep. She'd curled up in the aisle between two of the painting racks, on the smooth concrete floor, her cheek resting on her folded hands in the total, effortless way that Lily slept everywhere, as if the world were accommodating wherever she happened to be in it. Nadia stood in the entrance and looked at her for a long moment. The painting racks on either side of her daughter rose to the ceiling, each compartment holding something priceless inside breathable wrapping, and the lights overhead held their steady temperature, and the air was clean and dry, and Lily was asleep on the concrete floor between 53 paintings the world thought were in various states of gone or inaccessible, and none of that had registered as anything other than a comfortable place to lie down when she got tired. Nadia thought about 8 months on Clement Street and the shower that ran hot. She thought about the Route 9 motel and the 2 double beds, which had been more than they'd had before, and she'd held that as a positive the whole 3 months they were there. She thought about the duck pond Lily still mentioned sometimes when a walk went past water, not as a complaint, just the way children mention things they haven't stopped noticing the absence of. She crouched beside her and put her hand on her shoulder. "Time to go up, baby," she said. Lily opened her eyes. She looked at the painting racks above her and then at her mother. She said, "Are we going to keep it?" It was the simplest version of the question Marcus had asked. It had the directness of a child who had not yet learned to make complicated things sound simple or simple things sound complicated. Nadia said, "We're going to figure out what it needs. And then we're going to do that." Lily thought about this. She said, "The man who made all this. The one in the letter. Do you know why he did it?" "He wanted it to be seen," Nadia said, "by people who needed to see it." Lily looked around at the painting racks and the arched doorway into the next room and the lights running steadily overhead. A 7-year-old looking at 31 years of maintained hope, Nadia thought. Taking it in with the same frank attention she gave everything. She said, "Okay." She stood up and took her mother's hand, and the three of them went up the stairs. That evening, Nadia sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and started doing the research she hadn't let herself do until she'd seen everything. She pulled auction records for the artists named on the painting cards, cross-referencing the titles she'd written down in her phone's notes application during her first solo pass through the vault. She worked methodically, the way she'd worked every list in the past months, item by item, checking the records against the most recent available sales, noting dates of comparable works, building the column of numbers. She allowed herself 45 minutes on this task, and then made herself stop and do the gold next, because she needed the total to be assembled in order before she let herself feel anything about any single number in it. The gold was the simplest calculation. Weight times price per troy ounce. She ran it twice. Both times the result was the same. She did the artifacts at the conservative end of her estimates. She did the documents using the auction records for comparable historical materials, aware that she was working without specialist knowledge and that her numbers were almost certainly either too high or too low in ways she couldn't identify. Then she added the columns. When she reached the end of the painting list alone, she sat back and looked at what she'd written. Then she covered the paper with her hand for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Then she uncovered it and looked at it again. The number at the bottom of the painting column was not the total value of the collection. It was the estimated value of the paintings alone, based on comparable auction results for verified works by the same artists. It was not a number she could say to anyone who didn't already know about the vault without sounding like a person who had lost contact with ordinary reality. She added the gold at current market price. She used the conservative end of her estimates for the artifacts and the documents, because she had no way to be precise about those without specialist input. She added the numbers together. The total she arrived at was $487 million at the conservative end. There was a realistic case for considerably more, depending on what the provenance work revealed about the items with asterisks on their cards. Henry had said more than enough. He had understood the arithmetic of what he'd built. She looked at the number for a long time. She thought about what it would mean if she walked into a lawyer's office tomorrow and said these words. "I bought a condemned mansion for $400, and there is approximately $500 million in art and gold beneath it." She thought about what it would mean if she didn't. If she sealed the door and continued the way she'd been going, clearing rooms, addressing the inspector's list, paying the utility deposit in monthly installments. If she lived in the house above the vault for another year, another decade, telling no one. She thought about whether that was possible and decided quickly that it was not. Not because of legal risk or practical difficulty, but because of what Henry had asked. He had not built this to be hidden indefinitely. He had built it to be revealed when someone found it who understood what it was for. She had found it. She was beginning to understand what it was for. She thought about Henry's instruction. Open doors. Explain context. The assumption that the person walking through deserves to understand what they're seeing. She thought about who that person was, in Henry's vision and in her own. Not a collector, not a donor who wrote a check before a gala dinner, not someone who had grown up in rooms with art on the walls and learned early that beautiful things were available to them. Someone who had never been in a room with art on the walls and stood in front of it anyway, because they wanted to. Because they were hungry for it in the way Lily was hungry for the inventory notebook and Marcus was hungry for the engineering primers. Because nobody had told them they were supposed to want it, and they wanted it anyway. She had wanted it anyway, for years, in reading rooms she wasn't supposed to be in and libraries she'd used on her lunch breaks. She knew what that hunger felt like. She also knew, now, sitting at a kitchen table in a house she owned that contained $500 million in art, what it felt like to be on the other side of it. She thought about Lily on the floor of the first room, asleep between the painting racks. Outside the kitchen windows the neighborhood was dark and quiet. The street where the houses ran between 300,000 and a million was the street her children walked to school on now, which made it her street too. The same way the house was her house, and the vault was her vault, and Henry's letter was addressed to her even though he'd been dead for 31 years before she existed in a form that could receive it. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a while, listening to the house. Houses in this condition settle at night, releasing the pressures the day builds in them, the temperature changes and the small shifts that old structures make constantly. She knew this house's night sounds by now, had been learning them for 5 weeks. Below all of it, faint enough that she might have been imagining it, the climate system ran its cycle in the dark. She had come to this house because she had nowhere else to go. What she had found in it was not what she'd come for. It was not salvation in the form she'd been imagining when she sat in the shelter's computer room and looked at a photograph of a ruined Victorian mansion and thought, roof, walls, ours. It was something more and also something harder, because salvation in that version of the word involved a resolution, a state of rest, a place to land and stay. What Henry had left her was not rest. It was a task, a responsibility, a debt that wasn't financial but was just as binding, an obligation to a man she'd never met who had spent his life building something he couldn't finish alone and had left it for whoever came next. She sat with that for a while. The problem before her had a shape. She could see the outline of it from where she was sitting. The legal work that would be required to establish her claim to the vault's contents. The provenance research that would need to be done before anything could be publicly displayed. The institutional relationships she didn't have and would need to find. The question of how a woman with a provisional occupancy permit and a $400 acquisition gets the attention of the kind of people who could help her do what Henry had asked. She could see all of that clearly. She could also see that she had been in positions before where the path from where she was to where she needed to go was long and full of steps she didn't know how to take yet. That had never stopped her from starting. She went to find a piece of paper and started making a new list. Not of problems, of the people she would need. A lawyer who specialized in estate or cultural property law, an art authentication specialist, someone with knowledge of the post-war European art market and the provenance questions that came with it. Of the questions she would need to answer before she could ask anyone else anything. Of the order in which things needed to happen, because order mattered, and getting the order wrong in a situation like this would mean undoing damage that might not be undoable. The list was long. It was also the first list she'd made in years that didn't begin from a position of shortage. Everything she needed to do what Henry had asked was already beneath her feet. The documentation, the authentication records, the maintenance manual, the inventory in 37 handwritten pages. The letter. The only thing missing was the next step. And she was already writing it down. That was where she started. The list she made the night she found Henry's letter became the spine of the next 4 months. She started with the legal question because everything else depended on it. She didn't know a cultural property attorney. She didn't know any attorney except the legal aid woman from the eviction case, who had handled tenant rights and was not equipped for what Nadia was now looking at. She spent 3 evenings reading about the law of abandoned property, of unclaimed cultural assets, of the specific regulations governing art displaced in wartime Europe and subsequently held in private American collections. The shelter computer room had a 90-minute time limit per session. She used every minute. The question she kept arriving at was not whether she had a legal claim to the vault's contents, which the reading suggested she probably did, but whether establishing that claim publicly was compatible with what Henry had asked her to do. The two things were not necessarily in conflict, but the sequence mattered. She needed the legal claim established on her terms before anyone else's terms became the default. That meant a lawyer before anything else. A lawyer before any public word of what was below the house. The research led her to an organization she hadn't known existed, a nonprofit institute in Pittsburgh that worked on the legal restoration of art displaced during the Second World War, assisting families and institutions in establishing claims to works that had disappeared during that period. Their website listed staff attorneys and resolved cases, and at the bottom of the page, a note. They also provided consultations to individuals who had acquired art with complicated provenance and needed to understand their legal position. She called them on a Wednesday morning from the kitchen. The attorney she reached was named Ruth Nakamura. She'd been doing this work for 18 years and had a voice that was precise and unhurried in the way of someone who had learned to receive surprising information without letting the surprise show. Nadia told her everything, starting from the auction and the $400 and working forward to the vault and the paintings and the asterisk-marked cards and Henry's letter. Ruth was quiet on the other end after Nadia finished. Then she said, "Where are you located?" "Harker Falls. About 90 minutes east of you. Could I come and see the property?" "Yes." "When?" Ruth came on a Friday. She arrived alone, in a practical gray car, and walked up the driveway with the forward attention Nadia had come to value in people who were actually looking at the thing in front of them rather than deciding what to think about it first. Nadia gave her the full tour. The main house, the inspector's list with its check marks, the basement, the door in the fieldstone wall, then the stairs and the antechamber and the vault door and the 3 rooms. Ruth moved through all of it without speaking, reading cards, reading labels, making notes in a small paper notebook she carried. She spent a long time in the 3rd room with the document cases. She read the label on the 1778 letter case and wrote something down. She read the label on the musical score cases and wrote something else. When she came to the shelf where the envelope and the wooden box had rested, she looked at the empty space and nodded slightly, as if confirming something. In the antechamber afterward, Ruth stood for a moment looking at the vault door from the outside. She said, "How long has the climate system been running?" "Since 1962, as best I can determine. Henry's maintenance records stop in 1987, but the system was still running when I arrived. It's been running without interruption." Ruth said, "And you found it by following your daughter?" "By following my daughter, yes." Ruth wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. She said, "The vault's contents are not county property. The county acquired the land and the structure above through the tax lien. The vault was built by Henry Aldrich as private construction before the tax situation arose, and its contents were his personal property, never county assets. When the estate proceeded to intestacy with no heirs and no will specifying the collection's disposition, the contents went into legal limbo. As the current property owner, you have a claim to anything found on the property that was not previously claimed by another party." "What about the provenance items?" Nadia said. "The asterisk ones. More complicated. Some may be subject to restitution claims under international law. There are families and institutions with documented losses from that period who have standing to pursue claims on works that match their records. We'll need to run every asterisk item through the existing databases before anything goes public." "How long does that take?" "Several months. It depends on how many generate potential matches and how complex the individual chains are. And if some of them do match. If someone has a legitimate claim, then we work with them. We don't fight those claims." Henry's letter said he wasn't certain about the full history of some of what he acquired. He documented as much as he could and acknowledged the rest. That honesty helps us. Ruth took the case. Not pro bono. She was clear about that. But she was also clear that the fee structure could be arranged in a way that didn't require Nadia to have money before the work was done. They agreed on terms that gave Ruth a percentage of the eventual legal settlement of the collection status, which required each party to trust the other's reading of what the collection was worth, which required Ruth to believe what Nadia had told her on the phone. She clearly had. The authentication specialist Ruth brought in 3 weeks later was a woman named Dr. Carmen Sorrell, who had spent 20 years as director of European acquisitions for a major institution before leaving to run an independent practice. She arrived with 2 colleagues and spent 2 full days in the vault. On the 2nd day, in the late afternoon, Nadia was making dinner when she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Dr. Sorrell came into the kitchen and sat down across the table without being invited, the way people sit down when they have something significant to say and can't wait for ceremony. She said, "The 42 definitively authenticated paintings are everything Henry's cards say they are. Some of them are pieces that appear in the scholarly literature as lost. Not unknown, not undocumented, but specifically searched for. There are monographs about some of these. There are dissertations. Scholars have spent careers looking for what's in that first room." Nadia held her mug of tea and didn't say anything. Dr. Sorrell said, "The 11 with incomplete documentation will require additional laboratory analysis. My preliminary assessment is that at least 8 are genuine and of the same caliber as the others. The remaining 3 may be genuine or may be very good period pieces. I won't know until the analysis is complete. The artifacts are museum quality across the board. The coin collection alone will be the subject of scholarship for years. The documents and manuscripts I'd rather not characterize before we've cataloged them fully, but I can tell you that the third room alone justifies everything Henry spent on this project. The value, Nadia said. Dr. Sorrell looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, at current market, the paintings alone would bring between 280 and 340 million at auction if the provenance questions are resolved. The documents and manuscripts, conservatively, another 60 to 80. The artifacts depend on individual assessment. The gold is straightforward. The total, between 480 and 540 million dollars. That's a wide range, and it'll narrow as the analysis completes. The low end assumes the three uncertain paintings are period pieces and several artifacts come in at the lower end of my estimates. The high end assumes everything authenticates cleanly. Nadia set down her mug. She said, okay. Dr. Sorrell looked at her with something Nadia recognized. After a moment, as respect, she said, most people, at this point in the conversation, are asking me a different set of questions. What questions? About liquidation. About auction timelines. About how to realize the value as quickly as possible. Nadia thought about Henry's letter and the specific word he'd used. She said, that's not the conversation we're having. Dr. Sorrell nodded. She said, Ruth told me you wanted to open it to the public. Yes, she considered that. Then, it can be done. The provenance work has to come first. Then the legal framework. Then you'll need conservation staff, security, a management structure, operating funding. Nadia said, I know. I'm working on it. She was. The list that had started on a single piece of paper was now a folder of research and notes and draft proposals she'd been building in the early mornings before the children were up and the evenings after they went down. She'd been reading about museum governance and nonprofit law and cultural heritage funding and the specific mechanisms by which complicated collections had been resolved and made public in other countries and in other circumstances. The provenance work took 4 months. Ruth's team ran every asterisk item against the existing databases, the Art Loss Register, the ERR Project Archive, the digital records of institutions that had documented their wartime losses. Of the 61 items with asterisks, 11 generated potential matches. Of those 11, 6 were resolved without negotiation. Henry's documentation was detailed enough to show he had acquired the items from legitimate post-war sales, that the previous owners had voluntarily sold, or that no surviving claimant had standing. The remaining 5 required direct negotiation. Those 5 negotiations were the hardest months of Nadia's life, and she had had some hard months. Each case involved a family or an institution on the other side with a real history and a real loss. People who had spent decades knowing that something had been taken from them in the worst years of the previous century and not knowing where it had ended up. She sat in on 3 of the 5 negotiations in person and said very little, because the appropriate contribution in those rooms was not argument. It was acknowledgement. What she could do, and did, was agree without resistance in every case where the documentation supported the claim. The first negotiation was with a family in Vienna, represented by a grandson who had been born after the war and who had grown up with photographs of a painting that had hung in his grandmother's apartment before 1938. He was 60 years old, well-dressed, carrying a folder of documentation that he set on the table with the particular care of someone who has handled those papers many times over many years. He spoke through an interpreter. The painting he was claiming was the third one in the second rack on the left side of the first room, a work Nadia had paused at on her first solo pass through the vault because the label's asterisk notation had caught her eye. Ruth presented their documentation. The family's attorney presented theirs. The records aligned on every key point. The original ownership, the date of displacement, the sale in the post-war market through an intermediary that the family's attorney named specifically and that matched the name in Henry's acquisition records. Nadia said, yes, the painting belongs to your family. The grandson looked at her across the table. He said something in German. The interpreter said, he asks if you understand what this means to us. She said, yes, I understand. She did not say, your grandmother's apartment was the last place this painting hung before it came to rest in a vault for 31 years waiting for someone to open the door. She did not say, the man who bought it thought he was protecting it. She did not need to say either of those things in that room. The grandson knew the first part. Henry's letter accounted for the second. The painting left the vault 2 weeks later, in a climate-controlled transport case, bound for Vienna. The second negotiation was simpler in its paperwork and harder in the room. The claimant was an institution, a museum in Poland, whose pre-war collection records documented a specific medieval manuscript that matched one of the sealed tubes in the vault's second room. The institutional representative was a woman in her 50s who had been the museum's director for 12 years and who had personally championed the effort to trace the manuscript through the post-war dispersal records. She had written her doctoral dissertation on the manuscript 20 years before she'd known where it was. She came to Harker Falls herself rather than sending a representative. Nadia brought her down to the vault. When the tube was located on the shelf and the sealed case opened for Dr. Sorrell's verification, the museum director stood very close and looked at the manuscript through its protective cover without touching it, and she was quiet for a long time. Nadia stood back and gave her the space. That negotiation had no conflict. The documentation was complete on both sides. The manuscript was returned. What Nadia took from it was not the legal resolution, but the expression on the museum director's face when she'd first understood she was looking at a thing she'd spent her professional life knowing existed and not knowing where. 2 paintings left the collection. 1 artifact. 3 documents. Henry had written that he didn't know the full history of some of what he'd acquired. He had been honest about that uncertainty. That honesty, Ruth said in the final session, was the reason the process had taken months rather than years. The other parties recognized a good-faith position when they encountered one. In exchange for the restituted items, the negotiations produced something Ruth had been working toward from the beginning. Formal written acknowledgement from each claimant party that the remaining collection was clear, that Nadia's custodianship was legitimate, and that all 3 parties supported the establishment of the collection as a public institution. Ruth had framed this not as a concession, but as a natural outcome. She'd said, "You need credibility you can't manufacture. These families and institutions have it. Let them give it to you." They did. The story became public in October. Nadia had not planned October. She had planned to control the timing, to have the legal framework established and the funding structure in place before anyone outside the core team knew the collection existed. But one of the authentication lab technicians mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to a graduate student, who mentioned it to a reporter at the Pittsburgh Tribune, who called Ruth's office on a Thursday afternoon asking for comment on rumors of a major art discovery in Harker Falls. Ruth called Nadia that same hour. She said, "We have roughly 12 hours before this breaks on someone else's terms. Do you want to control it or respond to it?" Nadia said, "Control it." She spent that evening writing a statement. Not a press release written by someone else, not a document designed to manage perception, just an account of what had happened, in her own words, starting from the auction. She described the $400. She described the 8 months on Clement Street and what had led her to that listing on a shelter computer. She described Lily running up from the basement saying the stairs don't end. She described Henry's letter and what he'd asked for and why she had said yes. Ruth read it, made 2 small factual corrections, and sent it back otherwise unchanged. They released it at 6 in the morning. By 9 it had been picked up by the National Wire. By noon it was on every major outlet. By 3 in the afternoon, there were 2 camera crews at the end of the driveway filming the iron gates and the ivy-covered walls and the condemned notice that Nadia had not yet gotten to on the inspector's list. She watched the coverage from the kitchen with Marcus and Lily, who had come home from school to find their mother's name on the news and had handled this with the varying registers you'd expect from a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old. Marcus sat and watched with the focused, quiet attention he brought to information that required processing. Lily asked questions and then stopped asking questions and then sat with the TV and watched people stand in front of their house and talk about it. "It's our house," Lily said at one point, not possessively, just confirming the connection between the screen and the building she could see through the kitchen window. "Yes," Nadia said. Marcus said, "The camera shot is from the wrong angle. You can't see the east wing from there." This turned out to be one of the few accurate observations in an afternoon of coverage that Nadia watched with the mixed feeling of someone who has controlled a narrative as well as a narrative can be controlled and is now watching it go the places that all narratives go once they have enough velocity to move on their own. The story of the auction ran in every piece. For $100. the shelter computer, the listing with the photograph. People who had nothing to do with the story added their own interpretations. Some focused on the discovery, some on the collection's value, some on Henry and his wartime guilt, and what it meant that an American had spent 40 years quietly preserving things that Europe had lost. 2 op-eds ran the following week in major papers. Both were about her in a way that made her feel she was being described from a great distance by people who had read about her rather than listened to her. The statement she'd written herself remained the document she was most satisfied with, because it said what she meant and nothing she didn't mean, and she'd been the one who decided what it contained. The neighbor 3 doors down called at 4. His name was James Wentworth, a retired corporate attorney who had sent the certified letter in the first week. He said, "I wanted to apologize for the letter." Nadia said, "It's fine." It wasn't exactly fine in the sense of having been forgotten, but it wasn't a weight she was carrying either. She understood the calculation that produced the letter. A man who had built a stable life in a stable neighborhood saw an unknown person move into a condemned building next door and responded by doing the thing available to him. She didn't need him to feel worse about it than he already did. He said, "What you're doing with this, what you've planned, it's extraordinary." Nadia said, "Thank you." She answered calls for 5 more hours and then stopped answering because the volume made it physically impossible to do anything else. The next morning's paper ran her statement in full. The story continued for weeks. The discovery itself, then the provenance negotiations and the restituted works and the families who received them, then the announcement of the foundation and its public mission, then the renovation plans. Her sister Elena called from Pittsburgh on the evening the story broke. She'd spent the day watching it develop across 3 different news platforms. She was crying before Nadia said anything. She said, "Nadia, my God." "I know," Nadia said. "You knew this whole time. You didn't tell me. I couldn't tell anyone until the legal work was done. You could have told me. I'm your sister." "I know," Nadia said. "I'm sorry. I'm telling you now." "How are the kids?" "Marcus is trying to understand the authentication process. Lily is mostly interested in the coin collection." Elena laughed. It was the sound of someone releasing something they'd held for a long time. She said, "You're unbelievable." Nadia said, "You too." She meant it specifically. Elena had been afraid for her since October and had said so, calling every week and asking careful questions that Nadia had answered carefully, keeping the essential thing out of the answers because it couldn't be in them yet. That had required Elena to trust that her sister had a reason for what she wasn't saying. She had trusted it. That was not a small thing. They talked for 40 minutes. At the end, Elena said, "I want to come see it when it opens." "Can I?" "Yes," Nadia said. "Of course." Elena said, "I want to go down those stairs." "You'll count them," Nadia said. Lily miscounted. Elena laughed again. They said goodnight. Darren called. His call lasted 4 minutes. He said he'd always believed in her. She said thank you and ended the call with the particular patience that comes from caring about something too much to waste energy on its peripheral elements. Marcus, sitting at the kitchen table with his projections notebook, did not look up during the call or after it, which meant he'd heard enough to form his own view and had decided not to share it, which was one of the things about him that she thought would serve him well for a very long time. The inspector Carl sent a letter requesting to schedule the final re-inspection. She wrote back confirming the date. He arrived in November, walked the main structure, completed his checklist, and signed off on the provisional occupancy without comment about the story or the collection or the $500 million that had been 40 feet below every previous inspection. He signed the form, handed her a copy, and said, "You've done good work on this house." She said, "Thank you." She meant it the way you mean something that costs nothing to say and lands correctly anyway. The legal framework was established in February, 7 months after Ruth had first come to see the property. The Aldrich collection was formally declared a cultural heritage asset under Pennsylvania state law. The Aldrich Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit with Nadia as founding director, was established to manage and maintain the collection in perpetuity. The foundation's charter specified that the collection remain intact and publicly accessible without end. It could not be sold. It could not be dispersed. Individual items could be loaned to other institutions for temporary exhibition, but the collection's permanent home was here. The home was the Aldrich Estate. The renovation took 14 months and cost $3 million, funded through heritage grants. institutional donations from organizations that wanted to be associated with the story, and a single loan secured against the gold reserve. Nadia had spent 3 weeks in the autumn working through the grant landscape with a foundation development consultant Ruth had connected her with, a methodical woman named Diane who had written grant applications for cultural institutions for 20 years and who read Nadia's project description and said, "This is the easiest case I've ever had to make," and then set about making it with the efficiency of someone who meant what they said. The applications went in November. The first approval came back in December. By January, the foundation had received committed funding from 4 sources, with 3 more pending. The news coverage had done something Nadia had not anticipated, but Diane had. It had created a situation where institutions with cultural preservation mandates were calling the foundation rather than the other way around. The East Wing structural reinforcement came in at $11,000, not the $22,000 of the earlier estimate, because the engineer who joined the project found a less invasive solution the initial assessment had not considered. The kitchen plumbing went in at $17,000, slightly over the original quote, but acceptable given the expanded scope. She kept the cost logs in a spreadsheet she updated weekly, a habit from her hotel years that turned out to be directly useful when the foundation's first annual audit came due. The carriage house became the education wing. The library, re-roofed and restored to something close to what it had been in the 1890s, became the primary gallery for the manuscript and document collection. The foyer chandelier came down for cleaning and went back up when the crystals had been restored to the point where they refracted light again, filling the foyer in the afternoon with the kind of brightness that no modern fixture produces, the kind that makes you understand why people built in that style for so long. The vault below was fitted with permanent gallery lighting and interpretation panels developed by a team that spent 2 weeks in the space before proposing anything. The main staircase down had a proper railing now and proper lighting and a signage system explaining, at each landing, where you were going and what you were about to see. The climate management system had been serviced for the first time in 35 years and pronounced in excellent condition. The specialist said it had been built to a standard she hadn't seen replicated in anything constructed since the early 1990s. Nadia added this to the folder of things Henry had done right. The folder was substantial. The first painting came out of the rack and onto the wall of the upper gallery on a Tuesday in April. Nadia stood in the gallery and watched the conservation team handle it in cotton gloves and thought about Lily touching the edge of a frame in the underground light and pulling her hand back. The collection opened to the public on a Thursday in May. She had imagined the press, and there was press, a controlled group who had agreed to access in exchange for a 48-hour embargo so that the public could be there first. She had imagined the crowd. There was a crowd, a line that formed before the doors opened and extended down the driveway and past the iron gates, which stood open permanently now, their rust removed, their hinges oiled. What she hadn't imagined with enough specificity was the people. She stood at the entrance of the main gallery at 9 in the morning and watched them come in. A woman in her 70s who had driven 3 hours and waited in line for 40 minutes, who stopped in front of the first painting in the upper gallery and covered her mouth with both hands and stood there without moving. A family with 4 children, the youngest 5, the oldest 12, the 12-year-old working through the cases in the vault gallery with the focused deliberateness of someone who has found something that interests them all the way down. A man in his 40s in work clothes who came during what appeared to be a lunch break and read every label in the document cases without hurrying, moving down the row with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this without knowing what this was. A teenage girl, maybe 15, who came with a school group and separated from it, and stood at the entrance of the vault's first room and looked at the painting racks stretching away from her into the distance and didn't move. Her teacher came looking for her and found her there and started to say something, and then looked at what the girl was looking at and didn't say anything after all. They stood together for a while. By noon, the line outside extended past the gates. The opening had been publicized, but the size of the crowd had not been fully anticipated. Nadia had planned for 300 visitors in the day. By early afternoon, they had already passed that number. She spoke to many of them, not in a formal way, not as a director giving a tour, but in the way of someone who happened to be in the same rooms as other people and who answered questions when asked. A boy of about 9, standing in front of the gold in the second vault room, asked her why it was down here instead of in a bank. She said because the man who owned it wasn't interested in using it. He was interested in keeping it. The boy thought about this and said, "That's weird." She said, "Maybe. Or maybe he just understood that some things are worth more whole than spent." A retired schoolteacher named Patricia, who identified herself as having taught art history for 31 years at a high school 40 miles away, told Nadia that she'd spent 2 decades bringing students to this street on field trips to see the mansion from the outside because it was historically significant and always closed, and she wanted Nadia to know that she planned to bring every class she could manage for as long as her retirement allowed. Nadia said she hoped she would. An older man, maybe 80, came alone in the mid-afternoon and asked if he could sit in the antechamber for a while. She said of course. He sat in one of the chairs the conservation staff used during break and looked at the vault door and didn't ask anything else. She checked on him twice. He was fine. He left an hour later without explaining himself, which he was not obligated to do. She thought about that man for the rest of the day. She didn't know what he'd been sitting with. She didn't need to know. The space was for what people needed it for. At 2 in the afternoon, she went down to the vault herself. The conservation team had placed a few chairs in the antechamber for staff use. She sat in one and let the sounds from above come down the stairs. Footsteps, voices, the occasional sharp intake of breath from someone entering the first room for the first time. The climate control ran its steady cycle. The lights in the vault burned at their constant temperature. She sat with what it felt like to have Henry's request actually answered, to have opened the doors in the literal sense, and to have people walking through them. She thought about the year it had taken to get here from the night she'd read his letter by the light of her phone in the underground room. She thought about all the specific steps of the year. Ruth's gray car in the driveway, Dr. Sorrell sitting down at the kitchen table to deliver a number too large for the ordinary furniture of conversation, the negotiation sessions with the claimant families, the renovation meetings, the conservation team on their first day, the permits and the approvals and the insurance assessments and the grant applications and the 212 emails she'd answered in a single week in March when the foundation's public announcement went out and every cultural institution in the country seemed to notice. Simultaneously, she thought about how none of it had been straightforward and all of it had been necessary and none of it had required her to be someone other than who she'd been in the auction room when she raised her hand. She thought about the hotel, the $17 an hour and the key card for the supply elevator and the 7 years of reliable, unremarked-on competence that had added up to being let go in a room where the regional manager chose his words carefully. She thought about 61 applications and 3 callbacks. She thought about the Route 9 motel and the working burner and the $220 a week. She thought about the auction room, the folding chair, the 40 other people checking their phones while an auctioneer read the minimum bid on a condemned mansion with no assessed value and 4 acres of land, and no one raising their hand except her. She had raised her hand because she had nowhere else to go. She had gone down the stairs because a 7-year-old told her the stairs didn't end. The rest was the work that the two of them had found at the bottom. Marcus came down at 3. He sat beside her in the antechamber with his notebook, recording visitor flow observations in the methodical way he approached every measurable system. He said there had been 342 visitors in the first 5 hours, which was more than his projection for the full day. He said, "The woman in the green coat. The one who stood in front of the first painting." Nadia said, "I saw her. She came back in the afternoon. She was in front of a different one. She was still crying." "I know." He wrote something in the notebook. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been thinking about Henry." "What about him?" "He built all of this and died not knowing if anyone would find it, not knowing what they'd do with it. He never knew if it worked." Nadia said, "No, he didn't." Marcus was quiet again. She could tell he was working through something he hadn't finished yet. He said, "Does that seem sad to you?" She thought about it carefully, because he was asking carefully. She said, "I think it depends on what he believed when he built it. If you build something on actual faith, the not knowing is different from how it looks from the outside." He wrote in his letter that he believed the right person would find it. He chose to believe that. And then he let go of whether it would happen and just built the thing. Marcus considered this. He wrote something else in the notebook. Then he said, "I think he would have liked today." "Yes," she said. "I think so too." He looked at his projections again. He said, "The coin collection had more engagement than I projected. 2/3 of the visitors who went into the second room spent more than 4 minutes with the coins. I thought it would be the paintings. It's often the things people don't expect, Nadia said. The paintings are famous. People think they know what they're going to feel. The coins are old and small and specific, and they stop people. He wrote that down. She watched him write it and thought about a 12-year-old who read structural engineering primers and who would spend his whole life finding the rigorous version of what other people intuited, and how useful that would be for a long time to come. Lily arrived at 4, brought down by one of the education staff. She was carrying a printout she'd found in the archive room. A photograph of Henry Aldrich III from the 1940s, a young man in his 20s standing outside a building in Paris that the Foundation's research had identified as being in the district where several of the galleries were located that he'd visited on his first European trip. The photograph showed a man who looked like someone who had just understood something important and was not yet sure what to do about it. Lily held it carefully. She said, "He looks worried." "He was worried about a lot of things," Nadia said. "That's kind of why he built this." Lily looked at the photograph for another moment. She said, "Do you think he knows about today?" Nadia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "I don't know. I think what we can say is that what he built is working. And 342 people came today, and more will come tomorrow. And at some point, someone's going to come here and see something, and it'll change what they think is possible for themselves." That's what he wanted. Lily nodded. She put the photograph down carefully on the chair beside her mother and went back up the stairs to check on the snack situation in the education wing. Nadia sat alone in the antechamber for a while. In the evening, after the last visitor had left and the security team had locked the doors and the conservation staff had completed their final checks, she stood at the entrance to the main house and looked out at the driveway. The iron gates stood open at the end of it. Beyond them, the street where the houses ran between 300,000 and 1,000,000, quiet in the May evening. Tomorrow 2 or 300 more people would come up that driveway. The month after, considerably more. There were exhibition loan requests from 4 institutions in 3 countries. A documentary team Ruth had negotiated access for. A university partnership in progress for a research program that would work through the vault's document collection over the next several years. James Wentworth from 3 doors down had come to the opening. He'd stood in the public line and not identified himself. She'd seen him in the second room of the vault, standing in front of the gold stack, very still, looking at something he couldn't have imagined was under the street he'd lived on for 20 years. She hadn't gone to him. She'd let him have the moment without her in it. On his way out, he'd stopped her near the foyer. He said, "I owe you more than an apology." He meant the certified letter, she knew, but she thought he probably meant more than the letter specifically. He meant the entire accumulated presumption of a neighborhood that had sent letters and made calls and filed complaints rather than knocking on the gate and asking what she was doing in there. She said, "You don't owe me anything. Come back. Bring people." He nodded. He went down the steps. He turned at the bottom and looked back up at the portico and the columns and the restored facade, and she could see him doing what people do when they have to revise an image they've carried for a long time, setting down an old version and picking up a new one. Then he walked down the driveway and out through the open gates. She thought about the certified letter. She thought about the zoning call and the vegetation complaint she'd addressed over 4 Saturdays with a borrowed weed trimmer. She thought about the 6 seconds at the auction when no other hand had gone up. She thought about what the mansion had looked like to everyone who'd driven past it for 31 years. A failure, a liability, a problem no one wanted to solve because the solution cost more than the building was worth. She thought about what those same people would have said if she'd told them, on the day of the auction, what was going to happen. They would have said it wasn't possible. They would have been entirely reasonable to say so. All of the evidence available to all of the reasonable people in her life at that point in time supported the conclusion that buying a condemned mansion for $400 with 2 children and $800 total was not a viable path to anything. The evidence had been wrong. Not because she'd been right in some larger or more intuitive way, but because the evidence hadn't included the stairs. She had gone to that auction because she had nowhere else to go. She thought about what that meant now and concluded that it meant what it had always meant, that necessity and opportunity are not opposites. That the situation that forces you to look at something no one else is looking at is sometimes the same situation that lets you see what everyone else has missed. She had been desperate enough to buy a condemned mansion for $400. She had been thorough enough to read the inspection reports before she bid. She had been willing enough to wonder what a staircase going 50 feet underground was for, and then to go down in the morning and find out. She had been the right person not because she was exceptional, but because she was there and she was willing. And when a 7-year-old ran up from the basement saying the stairs don't end, she had gone down to see what that meant. She thought about what Henry had said in his letter. Whatever brought you here, whether it was curiosity or desperation or something else entirely, it brought you to the right place. He had not made any claim about what kind of person the right person would be. He had not said the person who finds this will be someone who deserved it, or someone who earned it, or someone who had anything particular to offer. He had said, "You are here." And that was sufficient. She had been here. She had gone down the stairs. She had read the letter and said yes. She thought about what yes had meant in practical terms. It had meant the 4 months of quiet work while the children went to school and the house around them kept becoming more of what it was supposed to be. It had meant the provenance negotiations and the 2 paintings that left and the ones that stayed. It had meant the renovation and the grant applications and the conservation team and the interpretation panels and the university partnership and the insurance and the security contracts and the staffing and the education program in the carriage house that had already run a pilot session with 47 middle school students 2 weeks before the public opening. It had meant she had a salary now and an office on the 2nd floor with windows that looked out over the property. In a room that had been a bedroom for an Aldrich she would never know anything about except that they'd chosen a room with good light. She came to the office every morning at 8:30 and worked until the children came home from school, and then she was a parent until the children were in bed, and then sometimes she worked again, and sometimes she didn't, because the difference between now and before was that now she could choose. She had not taken anything from the collection. She had not needed to. The foundation's operating budget covered her salary at a level that was not extravagant and was not the $400 she'd had on the morning she sat on the courthouse steps. It was enough. It had always only needed to be enough. She turned off the entrance light and went upstairs. Lily was asleep in her room. The pocket watch from the 3rd-floor closet sat on the windowsill, still ticking. Lily wound it every morning. It had kept time without interruption since the day she found it on the highest shelf of the 3rd-floor storage room, which was something Nadia thought about sometimes. A pocket watch sitting in a box in an abandoned house for 30 years, and then a 7-year-old found it. And it turned out the watch had just been waiting, the same as everything else in the house, for someone who would actually use it. Marcus was at his desk with the notebook. He looked up. "Good day," Nadia said. 342. Yes. He looked at his projections. He said, "Tomorrow will be more." She said, "I think you're right." She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. He was 12 years old, and he was running attendance projections in a notebook on the first day of a museum that hadn't existed 6 months ago, on a property she'd bought for $400 because she had nowhere else to go. She thought about what he might be doing at 22 or 32. She thought about the structural engineering primers on the shelter computer, and about the fact that there was a proper desk now in a proper room in a house where the heat worked and the water ran clear. She thought about Marcus at 9 years old, the year he'd stopped asking certain questions. She thought about the questions he'd started asking instead. She turned off the hall light. She went to bed in a house she owned, in a city she'd been displaced from and returned to, above a collection that belonged to everyone and therefore to her children too, in exactly the sense Henry had understood when he wrote the word scene and meant it as something that required no permission and no credentials and no prior relationship with wealth except the willingness to stand in front of something and look. She lay in the dark and did not count anything. She had spent years counting things because counting was how you maintained grip on a situation that was always trying to move past you. There was a specific feeling that came from stopping, from knowing the utilities were covered and the children were in their rooms, and the building was sound, and the work was meaningful, and the day had gone the way it was supposed to. She held that feeling and let it be what it was. Below her, through the floors and the basement and the cellar sections and the 30 stone steps, the climate system ran its cycle in the dark. The lights in the vault were off. The paintings rested in their racks in the cool, dry air. The documents sat in their cases. The gold reflected nothing because there was nothing to reflect. It had been waiting for 31 years. It had found what it was waiting for in a 7-year-old who opened a door she'd been told to leave alone, and a mother who went down in the morning to see what was at the bottom. Everything that came after that was work. Nadia had never been afraid of work. She closed her eyes. Outside the windows, the street was quiet and the gates were open. Morning would come, and the people would come with it, and the doors would open, and someone would descend 30 stone steps and stand in a room full of things the world had spent 31 years not knowing existed, and they would look. That looking was the point. It had always been the point. It was the only thing Henry had asked for. In the end, after all the planning and the building and the faith and the waiting, he had wanted it to be seen. It was being seen. That was what Henry had known when he wrote the letter and sealed the door and climbed the stairs for the last time and left the rest to whoever the future sent him. The future had sent Nadia Reyes. She had been exactly enough. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.